I would talk about this cognac versus what you would normally see. Ice, and then your mixer, which is 7-Up or Coke. And that's the entire, did people drink that at these weddings?
I mean, I don't know. I was pretty young at the time, so I wasn't keeping track. My cocktail radar was not operational at that point.
What are they talking about? They're talking about Hennessy right now. Okay.
Yeah, Hennessy for sure.
But why are they talking about Hennessy? People are making cocktails.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, the participants can see and hear you.
Oh yeah, because I told them about what, they can hear us?
Yes, they can.
I already talked about my cocktail?
Yeah.
They can actually hear us.
Yes.
I could say something horrible.
I was checking to make sure, but you're good. They can hear you. We are currently live to the.
Oh wait, we're live? They can see us too?
Yes.
This is happening. Yeah, we're just like.
Philip, what are you doing? You didn't tell us that we're on.
Sorry, I thought I heard you. Y'all heard me say we're live, and then y'all are pretty much the elevator music before we started.
Oh, then we should get started because. All right. Yeah, people know their weddings and their cognacs and everything like that. All right. Yeah, go ahead. Share your cocktails, people. Your cocktail recipes or whatever you're drinking right now. If you're non-alcoholic, drink something non-alcoholic. No pressure, of course. I think we're going to get started. Is that right?
Yeah. So we are officially live on Facebook, and we are live here on Zoom webinar, and we're ready to go.
Shots of Nook, man. Wow.
Okay. So
it better be Red Boat. Red Boat Nook, man, not the other stuff.
Yeah. All right. Welcome everyone to the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network presents Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. My name is Phuc Nguyen. I'm one of the staff members at DVAN, and I'm going to give you all a little bit of a welcome and introduction here today before we get started with Viet and Phuc and their conversation. A little bit about DVAN. DVAN is the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, whose mission is to really support diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian art around the world. And today we are debuting our new virtual event series, Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, which is a virtual series of programs that will feature a variety of writers, poets, artists, actors, filmmakers, scholars, and other cultural producers from the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian diaspora. So for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, our series, it will be hosted by Viet Nguyen, who's here, and we'll do a little introduction for Viet later, with co-host appearances by the She Who Has No Masters Collective, and our guests will engage in some of the virtual conversations and discussions regarding their work, their stories, and their communities. So welcome everyone. I want to take this moment to introduce our host, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the novel The Sympathizer and also one of the co-founders for the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, DVAN.
Hey, thanks so much, Philip. Welcome everybody to the debut of our show, I guess you would call it, Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. You know, the origins of this came from the fact that a few weeks ago, I did a conversation with the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen about her fabulous novel, The Mountains Sing. And it was such a success, we thought, why not make this into a series? Because there's so much literary talent out there among Vietnamese Americans. And of course, we started to think about it even more broadly, you know, not just writers, but also artists, and not just Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese people, but also Southeast Asians. You know, we want to acknowledge the history that brought us here to this country, the United States, where DVAN is physically based, and to acknowledge our alliances and our allegiances with our fellow Southeast Asian brothers, sisters, non-binary people as well. And so this series will hopefully bring a lot of provocative conversations to the foreground, and also, of course, just showcase the fact that there are really talented, artistic, innovative Southeast Asians who, by the definitions of our parents, are weird. Like, these are the people who did not necessarily make a career out of becoming lawyers and doctors and engineers, nothing wrong with that, but that they also, you know, want to pursue their own passions and their dreams. And with our guest tonight, Phuc Tran, we certainly are going to find someone who is very unique and certainly did pursue his passions and dreams in a way that I never would have anticipated. Phuc Tran is the author of Saigon, a debut memoir about what it was like to grow up as a refugee in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And when I heard about that, I was like, I have got to read this book because I spent a few years in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is not far from Carlisle, and Phuc and I basically went through the same refugee camp for Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. So maybe we ran into each other at the time, who knows? And the difference between the two of us, one of the differences, is that my family left Harrisburg in 1978, thank God, and went to San Jose, California in hopes of better weather and better economic opportunities. Phuc stayed for a while, and that is, you know, the subject of the book. And I always wondered what would have happened if we had never left Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I get some glimmer of this alternative life through Phuc. So we'll get into Phuc's biography more, but just a little bit about him that's really interesting. You know, he's been a teacher of classical languages for over 2 decades in high schools. We're talking about Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, which is incredible. So we'll talk about that. And he took his passion for languages and gave a TED Talk on the subjunctive, which you might imagine would be really, really boring, but it is not, which is testimony to, I assume, you know, Phuc's abilities as a teacher, but also as a speaker. So check it out on YouTube. You can find the TED Talk. It's 14 minutes long. And it connects the subjunctive to the experiences of being a Vietnamese refugee. And this, as we're going to talk about, is what led to the memoir that we're discussing today. He is also the owner of Tsunami Tattoo in Portland, Maine. He is an incredible tattoo artist. You can go to Instagram, look under Phuc Skywalker to see his work. So we'll talk about that. And he's married, has 2 girls, 6 and 9 years old, and he did in fact give them Latin and Greek classical names, as we would expect. So Phuc, welcome to Accented.
Thanks so much for having me, Viet. All right, so have you made your cocktail yet?
No, I want to go into the whole issue of the cocktail by starting off. I think people overheard us talking about this particular cocktail that I believe is the only one that Vietnamese people knew how to make of our parents' generation. And if you have ever been to a traditional Vietnamese-American wedding, you know that it involves, you know, a few hundred people, a very loud band, and at every table there is a bottle of cognac. Typically it is Hennessy, and if you really want to flex, it's Remy Martin XO, which runs about $100 a bottle. And I don't have either of those. I have this one that was gifted to me, and that doesn't make me authentically Vietnamese. But the weird thing is, I was in Paris and I wanted to be authentically Vietnamese. I went to the wine shop, liquor shop, and I wanted to buy a bottle of Remy Martin or Hennessy. And surprisingly, in France, or at least in these shops, I couldn't find them. So this is a Vietnamese-American innovation. Like, I don't know how Hennessy and Remy Martin got the American market, but the Vietnamese-Americans really got glommered onto that. And so you'll find a bottle of Remy or Hennessy at every table in a wedding. You have your ice. And the cocktail is very, very simple. You know, depending on what you want to do, you pour in a requisite amount of cognac. You should be smoking in the pre-non-smoking days in these weddings. And the band should be playing Hotel California, preferably. And then there's always a bottle of 7-Up or Coke. Take your mixer of choice. And then you ruin your cognac by pouring it into your cognac. And this, I'm going to call this the Saigon in honor of your book. Because, you know, at these weddings, what is served besides 10 courses of Chinese food? I mean, we go figure. We, as a nation, Vietnamese people have a lot of problems with the Chinese, but we always have Chinese food at these wedding banquets. And the 11th course, at least for our parents' generation, from what I could tell, is nostalgia about Saigon. So here we have Saigon. What are you having?
I'm having a New York sour. It's melted a little bit, but it had red wine float and then bourbon at the bottom.
Well, awesome. So let's start off with our shared history here. We ended up in Fort Indiantown Gap, and I just recently learned about the very dramatic story of your family's escape from Saigon. In fact, I think every Vietnamese person has a dramatic story of escape, but you in particular had a very dramatic one. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. So my grandparents worked for the U.S. Embassy, and in April of 1975, when they got the call to leave, and they were told that they had the golden ticket to get on a transport to get out. They rounded up 12 family members. My grandmother has since told me that I have that number wrong, but I think it was like 14 anyway. I'm just apologizing because I'm going to get like an angry text from my grandmother who's like, I told you it was 14. It's like, anyway. So she rounded up a bunch of people. I don't know, how you make that heartbreaking decision on who to take and who to leave behind. It's mind-boggling. But we were in line to get on a bus that was going to take us to the airfield. And we got on the bus, and I started crying, like shrieking uncontrollably. And, my grandmother was like, this is super annoying and embarrassing. Everybody get off the bus. So my entire family got off the bus because of me and my tantrum. And then we let the people behind us get on. And then as that bus pulled away, it was struck by artillery fire and blew up, and everybody on that bus died. And we waited and got on the next bus and crossed our fingers.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's a horrible story. It's a really tragic, sad story. On the other hand, everybody I know who was a refugee had something dramatic. And when we hear stories like this, we're like, okay, it's terrible, it's sad, it's shocking, but this entire generation went through this. This is normal for us. If you were the Vietnamese refugee who left 3 weeks early on a private Pan Am flight, that's the exceptional story. But most people left under great duress, and I think this is why it's such a traumatizing experience to be a refugee, and it sets us off from many of our fellow Americans, because I think there's no quicker way to kill a cocktail party conversation and say, hey, I'm a refugee, because most Americans have no clue what this involves. And so here you are, your family goes and they're sent to Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, one of 4 camps in the country to hold Vietnamese refugees. The ones who got the jackpot win were the ones who went to Camp Pendleton in San Diego. They were already in California at that point. And you're there, and you have a very interesting line, I think, in one of your interviews to describe what it's like to be in this refugee camp. You said it's like being like an animal in a rescue shelter waiting for an American to come along and pick you. So can you describe that experience?
Yeah. I mean, it was, like they weren't, the government, the U.S. government wasn't, I think, rightly or wrongly, they didn't want to just bring, as right, it was like, I'm saying this for our audience's sake, it was an incredibly unpopular decision anyway for Gerald Ford to bring any Vietnamese people over, and then, I think rightly, they were like, well, we can't just like release them into the wild, like free range with zero support. And so they enlisted the help of these VOLAGs, right, the volunteer organizations. And so they would only release these Vietnamese families if they had, under the auspices of these sponsor families, right? So these people were like, okay, like, I guess I'm going to be like the foster parent for these, folks until they can get their feet under them. So yeah, my understanding is that, some families didn't want to be split up, or refused to be split up, or sometimes didn't have the choice, as it was with your family, right? Like they just were like, okay, this family only wants this kid, so we're going to let him go. It's kind of terrifying, right? But I say this knowing that there are families and children separated living in detention centers all along the border too. So
yeah, it's kind of a weird thing, obviously, as you were saying, that in 75, a lot of Americans did not want to accept refugees from Vietnam or from Cambodia or Laos, and really through an act of Congress and through the advocacy of other Americans, including African Americans, we were lucky enough to get admitted as an emergency act. And now, I don't know what your experience is, but in California, there are some Vietnamese American former refugees who are not in support of welcoming new refugees to this country, because they say stuff like, we Vietnamese people were the good refugees. These new people from south of the border, for example, are bad refugees, unassimilable and all that kind of thing. And I don't know what it was like for you, but I grew up in San Jose, California, in a heavily Vietnamese refugee community. And there were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees. I mean, these are terrible, terrible things. The minor stuff was just like, cash cheating economy, cash under the table economy, welfare fraud, this kind of thing, normal stuff. People were gaming the system to try to, obviously do the best for themselves. And then there was like gangsters, like real hardcore Vietnamese gangsters who were really scary people. So there were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees, and that history has been forgotten. And then of course, the history of how we got into this country has been forgotten. But I don't know, what is your experience with that? I mean, do you hear support for refugees among the Vietnamese people or is there actually ambivalence about this?
I mean, I think I run with a pretty liberal and left-leaning crowd, and my parents play, they keep their cards really close to their chest, and that's really the extent to which, like, I have political conversations with other Vietnamese people.
Lucky you.
I mean, I don't, like, whether by fate or by design, like, I've never been I've never had a quorum of other Vietnamese people physically to be around, like, in fact, like, I think, through the beauty of the internet, like, and things like DVAN, where it's like, oh, look at all these, like, Viet people, like, doing all these awesome things, but I mean, I think, like, the idea of growing up in a place like San Jose, where there's a critical mass of Vietnamese people, like, just is so foreign to me. It's very strange.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, I went back to Harrisburg maybe 10 years ago just to see what the town was like. I hadn't been there since 1978. And I had a good time from 1975 to 1978 in Harrisburg. There was snow. That was cool. I was a kid. My parents were underemployed, let's say, much less than they were doing in Vietnam. So they experienced downward social mobility. But the ironic part of that meant that they actually had more time to spend with me. So I enjoyed it. Like, we went to New York City, to Atlantic City. I had a birthday party. The only birthday party I ever had in my entire childhood was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Then I moved to San Jose, heavily Vietnamese refugee community. That leaves its imprint on you to be surrounded by Vietnamese people. You grew up in Carlisle, and you're the only Vietnamese family in Carlisle?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know, and this is the subject matter, part of the subject matter of your memoir. So I was like, that undoubtedly produces a very different kind of person, And I've grown up with a very conflicted relationship to being Vietnamese because I was in a Vietnamese community. I'm wondering if you have a conflicted relationship or whether it's irrelevant to you with being Vietnamese with your particular background.
So interesting, and I think of that E.B. White quote about wanting to wake up in the morning and feeling conflicted because he wants to just part of him wants to just enjoy the world the way it is, and then part of him wants to make it a better place. and there's a kind of ahistorical angle to that, that sometimes I wake up and I'm like the only reason that we're talking about my being Vietnamese is because, I'm living in the specter of sort of whiteness, right? And I think my parents were huge, and I don't know if this is true for your parents, but my parents believed in they still do. They believe in the American dream. Like, I can't say anything sideways to them about, like, systemic this or that, or like the politics. They're like, no, like, you're so ungrateful that you don't know. So I get it. So I think growing up, like, my parents' goal was like, we want you to be assimilated, right? Because it was the 70s, right? Like, there was no question that the idea was like America was a melting pot, and like you just became American, and then that was it. Like, so my parents thought this is a great deal. Like, we read the brochure on the Statue of Liberty, like, we're the tired, huddled masses. So I think assimilation came fast and hard for me and my brother in Carlisle in a way that I think I can't speak to the experience of like a place like San Jose or Orange County or anything like that. But
well, let's take a look at one of the slides. Philip, can you bring up the slide with Phuc's family in Carlisle? Can you tell us about what we're seeing here?
Sure. I mean, this was, right when we got to the slide on the left is, so, my family is Catholic, devoutly Catholic. And so, so that's me in the bright orange coat. My mother's holding me, and then we're meeting with the parish priest. I don't remember his name. And then the nice blonde ladies to the left are some of the sponsor families that sponsored our family. So I think there are friends too. So, like we were the only Vietnamese family that stayed. Like my understanding is that there were a few Vietnamese families that would sort of come, or just like random refugees would come, relocate to Carlisle and then leave within a year or two. But my family stayed for 2 decades in Carlisle, and even after people were encouraging my parents to leave, I had relatives all over the U.S. and my parents just for whatever reason really wanted to stay in Carlisle. And then on the right is my father, my mother, me, and then my bako, so my great-grandmother, maternal great-grandmother. And again, right, like what an amazing decision for my grandmother to make, right? Like of all the people that you can pick, you pick like your 76-year-old grandmother to or 76-year-old mother to like make this like harrowing trip across the Pacific to the US. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, most Vietnamese people were very eager to move and again find a place with more Vietnamese people, better weather, all that kind of thing. Why do you think your parents didn't want to do that?
It's such a good question. And they haven't really, I think they were so traumatized by the uprooting that, they both felt like they had jobs and they had a home and that was as good as it was going to get, because they felt like they had already hit rock bottom. And I think aspirationally, they just couldn't imagine things being better than they were because, for them, I think they were like, well, we're not dead, right? I mean, the bar is so low for them in in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like they're like, okay, we have food and shelter, all right, good enough. Let's stop, let's not try our luck for, like God forbid we want things like community, or a sense of belonging or anything like that. So,
and then your memoir delves quite a bit into your relationship with your father. And, like many of these Vietnamese men, he had a life in Vietnam. He had an identity, he had a career. Tell us about that, and then tell us what happened when he came to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, he was a lawyer. He had just finished law school, married my mother, had me. Their plan was to have 7 more kids. He was living in his familial house, so he was there. His older sister was there. It was like like 17 people or something in this bustling house, and he spoke Vietnamese, excuse me, and then a little bit of French, and for whatever reason, my dad learned German, but he never bothered to learn English, even though his in-laws spoke perfect English. And yeah, so so my father was a lawyer in Vietnam. And so when he came to the US, he didn't speak any English, and, had this like law degree and, this like legal knowledge that he couldn't apply. So he ended up working at a tire factory, like just a total blue collar job in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So that's what happened to my parents too. They were business people, self-made business people. And then they came to Harrisburg and they were refugees. And what was expected of them by their sponsors and by Americans was that they start at the bottom. I think my parents started off as janitors in a nursing home, and they're like, no, this is not for us. And for a lot of my parents had other abilities. They were merchants. They could go and start their own business. If you're a Vietnamese lawyer, it's a lot harder to obviously restart. And so then obviously, one of the tremendous consequences of being a refugee is the psychological damage that's rendered on people who've lost everything and can't rebuild. And then they take it out, I assume, on their kids, and this is how history transmits itself. It's not like, people of our generation, we don't have a memory of the war or even necessarily of Vietnam, but history ripples, and it ripples through our parents and through our communities, and it hits us. So tell us about what that was like living in your family's household in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I dedicate a whole chapter to, this idea of violence, as a way of communication in my family. And it's as a child, like everything is normalized. Like you don't know what's, sort of aberrational behavior or aberrant behavior and what's not. And it's not until older, right? And like you start thinking like, that doesn't seem right. Or, or when you're an adolescent and your own humanities kind of like, burbles up a little bit. So I think that's, and I think I think to speak to the idea of like trauma and the rippling of it, you know, I think like I think also my parents' generation is not great about talking about mental health. You know, I think like there's been lots written about like the Vietnamese community in general and sort of talking about mental health, but I think also sort of Asian cultures in general and sort of, you know, their reluctance to talk about mental health as like a real facet of, you know, sort of like being healthy and individuated, right? So I think everyone's suffering from PTSD. They don't know how to deal with it. And so they take it out on their kids. They take it out on each other, right? And also, like, even while the bricks are crumbling, right, they're all still held together by this deep filial piety, right, and shared experience. So it's kind of this, like, you know, I mean, it's this facade that's, like, very, you know, fragile, right?
Yeah, it gives us a lot to write about, as you have done. Let's play your book trailer. So that people can get a sense of Saigon. Philip, can you do that for us?
Hey, I'm Phuc. I'm a Latin teacher and a tattooer. This is my shop, and this is my book. It's a book about, well, what the hell is it about? You know what? Let's rewind. Is the book about my family and the sacrifices they made to escape Vietnam? Or is it about growing up in small-town America? Is it about immigration or assimilation? Rebellion or loyalty? Murder or love? I guess it's actually about Star Wars. Or maybe it's about punk rock. Or maybe it's about the books I love that made me who I am. My book is about all those things, but it's about being more than those things. I'm more than just the sum of my parts and experiences. Let's not forget the words of Walt Whitman. I contradict myself. I contain multitudes.
Cool. Man, I was never so sophisticated as to get a book trailer done, so I am deeply impressed. And there's a lot to unpack there. First, let's begin with your name, Phuc. You know, there was a recent controversy. I don't know if you were following this controversy about this Vietnamese-American student named Phuc Bui in Oakland. That's just her first name. And then this, for those of you who don't know, I don't know how you would not know, this blew up. I was like a gigantic social media thing. The news rippled all the way to Vietnam. Vietnamese people all over the world are pissed. But what was really interesting to me was that a lot of non-Vietnamese people were pissed about what happened too. And basically what happened is she was in this class with a professor, and the professor said, you know, your name in English is offensive. And I want you to change your name for the class. And she said, I'm going to take you to Title IX. I was so impressed. This was her first reaction, not to try to explain herself. She's like, you're screwed up. I'm going to take you to Title IX. And then he doubled down and he said, imagine if the equivalent name in English, if I went to Vietnam, he said, and my name translated into Vietnamese as eat a dick or something like that. And so that was what happened. You know, that got shared on social media, blew up. So much support for Phuc Bui. I can't imagine that in the late 1970s, for example, that this was happening in Carlisle, that there were people going around saying, oh yes, Phuc. Phuc is a Vietnamese name that means blessings, I believe is what it means. You know, so tell us what that was like growing up as Phuc in Pennsylvania.
You know, I mean, I think like it got worse like the older we got. You know, like again, like young kids, like it wasn't really an issue in elementary school. Like it was just sort of like, oh, this is Phuc, like that's it. Like, and then like once, you know, sort of like profanity started creeping in at the edges of our consciousness, right? And then like I remember very distinctly in 5th grade, like learning, or maybe 4th grade, learning about like, you know, fuck, and I was like, oh boy, I was like, that sounds a lot like my name. No, and I tried to change my name from one day to Peter, unsuccessfully. Because because I was immediately, I mean, like the kids who were making fun of me were like, oh, you changed your name to Peter? Well, suck my Peter then. I was like, shit. You know, like I had no idea that, you know, Peter was a double entendre for a penis. So then I just switched back to Phuc, and I was like, I also doubled down.
Yeah, but yeah, that's impressive. You know, I think it's hard when you're Phuc or Bit, you know, or young to do that, you know, to have the courage to do that, or stubbornness, or whatever you want to call it. But maybe it's an early sign of your punk rockerness. So you're like, fuck off, I'm Phuc. So at some point you became an adolescent, and you got turned on to skateboarding and to punk rock, which, you know, I have no relationship to. I can't skateboard, and I was not into punk rock. So how did that happen?
You know, I mean, I think in 8th grade, like I just happened to, my parents moved to a neighborhood, and I, bought like a secondhand skateboard from my neighbor, and started skateboarding and fell in with these kids. And I think like, it was this is 1986, and so like anything weird drew the attention of, a certain group of kids who just like, they just wanted to kick your ass. It was sort of like the normal police, it's like, why are you riding around on 4 wheels, 2 wheels, because bicycles. And so like, even if they saw you skateboarding, they would yell at you. And so, there was like a small cadre of kids who would skateboard in my town. And, in the 80s, like skateboarding culture and punk culture were, sort of deeply fused together. And so I was introduced to, punk rock music. And, I think as an adolescent, when you're already angry, like you just, about, whatever you're angry about, like, I think like punk rock is just like that, it's the powder keg that you just need. And you're like, wait, like it's the fuse really, right? It lights the whole thing off. And then you're just angry about everything for a couple of years.
So this is your form of rebellion, but also your form of finding another community outside of your family and the norms of high school, right?
And weirdly judgment free, like I think, for all the judgment that came from my parents and, Catholicism and, at least the way that they practiced it, it was so refreshing to be around kids who just, they didn't care, and I recognized that for me, like I was just saying to somebody, sometimes it felt like a vacation to me to be around these kids. And the most important thing that we were talking about was like a new record or like where we could steal beer. Like we weren't talking about racism, we weren't talking about assimilation or, just like shitty things like that. We were just like, oh, I did this new skate trick, and it's like, great. Like that seems really refreshing for a minute.
So, I mean, you have commented elsewhere that, you being Vietnamese is not that big of a deal to you, that you find more sustenance, let's say, in tattoos, in classical languages, in literature. Nothing wrong with that at all. I'm just curious about that, because I am just like, for better and for worse, stuck to being Vietnamese. I tried. I read Jane Austen when I was in high school, and I became an English major, which you hated, by the way, which is interesting. But I became an English major, and I did, all the canonical literatures and everything of Anglo-American canon. But I never could have imagined becoming a writer if I did that, because I would have to go home and explain to my parents, hey, mom and dad, I'm going to get a PhD in romantic poets. This is not going to fly with Vietnamese refugee shopkeeper parents. So I had to find some kind of social justice narrative to make sense out of my love for literature. And that was through being Vietnamese, and then through being an Asian American, and then through being a person of color and all this. But I couldn't just never imagine myself doing what you do, and saying, I'm just going to do Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, which I think is fantastic. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, for me, psychologically, it's very difficult. So I'm really interested in that psychology, how you ended up there, you think, and this. Do you think you're free of being Vietnamese? Because I feel like I'm glad to be Vietnamese, but I also feel like I'm sort of like, I'm just bound by it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it loops back to the idea of being ahistorical, right? Like, I think at least in the classical languages, like I feel like nobody really can make a claim to Latin or Greek being like, of their provenance. And there's like very little insider outsider status in my mind for Latin and Greek other than your mastery of it. And, I excelled at it, so like I just showed up, and it wasn't like, oh, this kid's Italian, so he has like a special claim on, being a Latin scholar, but if his Latin sucks, like he's out. And I think it was very clear, like, I was a good Latin student, and not to toot my own horn, and I was a very good Greek student. And so that my professors and my classmates were like, oh, like, who the fuck is this kid? And I was like, I don't know, like, this is cool, let's do it. I mean, I love being Vietnamese, but it's kind of like, to me, like, it's so deeply part of who I am that it feels boring. Like, if that makes, it's like, tell me about having black hair. You're like, oh, really? Like, again? Like, okay, like I have black hair. I don't know. Like, it's, and I think anytime I've had conversations about it, again, I guess I don't want to play this as like an either or, positioning with your take on it, is like, I feel like when I have to talk about being a Vietnamese, it's always in the context of whiteness. And I think it comes from not living in a place like San Jose. So, I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to a very white college, and now I live in Maine, which is like one of the the second whitest state in the country. So I think when my being Vietnamese comes up, it's unless I'm going to the local Vietnamese restaurant, and then they're really excited to see me, and then we like catch up, with gossip or whatever. Like I don't really have a community around which to gather. So yeah, I don't know.
But you have talked about punk and punk music as being tied to a sense of social justice for you. This is part of your social justice community. And obviously that's true. If you look at punk, we don't have time to get into punk music with its political commitments and stuff. But I don't know. I mean, we're living through a really difficult time right now when questions of social justice are inevitable for most of us, whether we want to acknowledge them or reject them. We have to confront them and everything like that. What is your take on, what's happening at this moment for whether it's Vietnamese or Asian Americans or people of color, for yourself in Portland, Maine? Like, what is the situation out there around Black Lives Matter, around these questions of what the country is going through?
Yeah, I mean, I was super, I'll dish a little bit since it's Friday night and we're having cocktails. 4 years ago when Philando Castile was murdered, like I lost my mind. I remember sitting in a restaurant with my wife, telling her about the video, and actually I started crying, and I was like, I got to do something. And so I made Black Lives stickers, and I was going to display them at the school that I work at, and they were not entirely supportive, and I was super angry about it, and I drafted a letter of resignation, and they were like, well, we got to think about it. And I thought, okay, if they come back and they're like, you can't put them up, I was like, fuck this, I'm out. And it didn't play out that way, but I felt like an outlier, 4 years ago, 2016, it was, kind of politically charged to say Black Lives Matter. And now all of a sudden it's Nike and Apple, and it's kind of amazing. In 4 years, I've never seen a pendular swing this radical. So it gives me a lot of hope.
This is true in Portland, Maine. This is true.
I was just camping this week. I'm driving in the middle of bumfuck Maine, and there are signs up that say Black Lives Matter. I mean, never mind that there are also, Trump Pence signs and whatever. I mean, the fact that we're driving in the second whitest state in the country, and there are people who are hanging up signs showing allyship it's pretty powerful. So yeah. I'm hopeful. I feel hopeful. But I recognize I'm in a, echo chamber, and, I want to actively engage the other side, other people in conversation, but I feel hopeful. How are you feeling? What do you think?
I've been doing this all my life, so for me, I've been waiting for this moment since the 1990s when I was at Berkeley. At Berkeley, I was being educated by professors who had gone to Berkeley in the 60s, and they were telling us, it's happening, the 1990s will be like the 1960s again. And we're like, yeah. And then, of course, it was not, and all these terrible things have happened from 1990 to 2020. And so it's not, wars, the economy, Black people getting killed. It's not like they're just starting getting killed in the last year, So for me, it's really amazing to see that this time, the death of George Floyd, has been the trigger to bring people into awareness, And I think it's the accumulation of all these things that we've been watching on video for the last decade, or ever since Rodney King, really. But accelerated now with the digital media and phones has made it unavoidable. You could watch Rodney King's video. First time you ever seen a Black man being beaten on video, and then the defense lawyers would parse it and try to analyze this from different angles, and people could excuse what they saw. And now with a plethora of videos, you as a white person or as a non-Black person, just have to be racist. You just have to be racist if you go around denying that this stuff happens and that it's a function of structural racism. And so now I think it's a decisive moment. Everybody has to make a decision, including Vietnamese and Asian Americans. And what really sucks is that a lot of Vietnamese Americans are making the wrong decision, dude. There are a lot of Vietnamese American supporters of MAGA, of Donald Trump, of All Lives Matter, of Blue Lives Matter. It's infuriating. Yeah. And so I'm just carrying on my own little fight on my social media besides what I write in New York Times and Time Magazine, right? But that's why it's a very personal stake. I mean, everybody else can be racist. It's fine. We live in a racist country, you know, but Vietnamese people's racism really pisses me off because, you know, Vietnamese people would be so upset if we were subjected to racism, and then we turn around, we're racist to other people. The hypocrisy is mind-blowing, you know. So anyway, I think I assume we share that feeling. I want to make sure we also get to hear from your book. You're going to read a passage from us to us from Saigon.
For sure. Yeah, this is just a quick passage, and it's right when I'm about to go trick-or-treating for the first time with my hooligan punk rock friends, and my younger brother Lou is going to ask to come along. It's just a quick bit here. Halloween 1987. I walked by Lou's room as he was unpackaging a tube of fake blood to smear in the corners of his mouth. He was trying on his hinged vampire fangs, a Transylvanian orthodontist inspecting his teeth in the mirror. "Hey!" Lou lisped and spat, fangs popping in and out of place. "Are you going trick-or-treating? Where are you guys going? Is there going to be a lob of candy?" I lied. "Yeah, just me and my friends though. You can't come." He couldn't come because he was still a kid. He wasn't a high school hoodlum. He didn't need to be like me or hang out with me and my friends. Or did he? In fact, I didn't want Lou to come because I wanted to preserve just one more Halloween of candy for my brother before it turned to vandalism. Lou took out his Dracula teeth to make sure I understood his earnestness. "Why can't I come? I can keep up with you guys. I can. That might have been true if we weren't running from house to house, stealing pumpkins and throwing eggs." "You can't come with us." "Why not? Where are you going trick-or-treating? Maybe I'll just go to that neighborhood too," threatened the dejected vampire. "You know what? We're not even going trick-or-treating." "What?" It was unimaginable to him. "But it's Halloween." "We're doing something better than trick-or-treating." Lou, defanged, was all ears now. "What's better than trick-or-treating?" He eyed me skeptically. My parents weren't home, so I spoke brazenly. "We're egging houses and stealing pumpkins. Don't tell mom and dad or I'll beat your ass. You'll fucking regret it." I didn't swear often at Lou, and it loaded my intent with purpose. "Are you serious? Let me come, please?" His entreaty was innocent and wholly sincere, and I couldn't ignore the half-applied vampire blood on his mouth as he was asking to be taken seriously. I was trying not to be a child anymore, and here was Lou asking the same thing. I looked at him and thought about myself in 6th grade. I would have appreciated a hint of what the rest of middle school and high school would be. Maybe it was time for him to see what high school was about. Maybe it would help him and make his 6th grade year easier than it was for me. "Okay, you can come." "Really? Okay." He was beside himself with the prospect of hanging out with us. "Wait, do we go trick-or-treating after we go egging?" "No, we don't, just egging." "But what about the free candy?" "You can buy candy anytime. Jesus, you want to go with us or do you want to argue about candy?" Lou persisted. "Well, I'm just saying, you can go egging anytime too, but Halloween, you know, it's free candy. Look, there's no free candy tonight, so just don't fucking complain tomorrow about not having any candy, okay?" The second F-bomb I dropped ended the conversation. Lou surrendered. Okay, I won't complain. Thanks for letting me come." "Good. Wear dark clothes. We're leaving at 5:30 p.m. on foot."
You know, what that reminds me of, that I remember very vividly from Halloween in Harrisburg, my brother and I went out. I must have been like 7 maybe, and so we would have been 14, 13. We got robbed on Halloween night. You know, this gang of kids took our candy. My brother was so mad, he brought me back home and then he went out back to look for those kids, you know. So anyway, man. All right, I don't know. I hope it wasn't racist. I hope it was just like just kids being mean. But hey, yeah. Hey, we have a bunch of questions. They look like very interesting questions, and I have drunk almost the entire Saigon, so my capacity to ask questions is getting kind of limited right now. And some of these questions will bring up some of the additional slides that we have. So I'm going to call on Philip to come back here and do question roulette with Phuc.
These are for you too, right? Like questions that you and or I will answer.
Well, some of them are, but I think obviously the focus should be on our star, Phuc.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of Q&A questions from the Zoom that folks have been upvoting for you both. Also, if you wanted to grab a refill of your Saigon cocktail. Our top voted question for both of you is, what are your thoughts about Vietnamese authenticity, from Michael Nguyen? As a US-born, non-Vietnamese speaking Vietnamese American, I sometimes wonder how Vietnamese I am or can claim to be.
Phuc, you should answer that one first.
Easy question, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, gosh, that's so tricky. I mean, I think authentic. I mean, I'll say this. One of the things that I love about growing up in the U.S. is this idea of sort of self-actualization. You know, like it's a theme that runs through pop culture. Like, and I know that it's like this sort of silly trope, but I think that at least in this country, there's more latitude to be who you want to be than in many other places. I haven't lived in many other places, so I can't say, but I think, and my parents certainly believe that, you know, like, so and I'm not sure what it means to be authentically Vietnamese. And I guess the other question is like, what is, like, if that's a missing gap for you, then maybe it's important to think about that. But, or if it's important to be seen or perceived as authentically Vietnamese. And also, like, who's sitting in the judge's seat, right? Like, that's tricky. I mean, like, I get regularly kicked out or pulled into authentic Vietnamese culture all the time, and frankly American culture all the time, right? I mean, I think it's like, I think being Asian American, it's tricky. It's like one minute you belong to one group, and then the next minute you get kicked out, and you're like, wait, what? Like, when did membership get rescinded? Because I think, you know, I think Viet's piece in Time magazine, I think, is great and illustrates some of that, about this slippery idea of Americanness that we're constantly trying to prove. But I think being Vietnamese American, I guess I'm not, I don't feel like I'm in a position to prove my Vietnameseness to anybody, because I think it's also like, I think it's my sort of oppositional nature that I just don't care. Like, I'm just happy being who I am, and, you know, people think I'm Vietnamese enough, great. And if they don't, like, I don't need to hang out with them. I don't know.
Well, I wrote an entire essay on Vietnamese authenticity. I just put it in the chat window for people who want to read it. But just very briefly, you know, I grew up in a household where my parents, my father really, told me all the time, you are 100% Vietnamese. It really fucked me up. Then my parents get a chance 20 years after, you know, escaping Vietnam to go back. They go back, they return, and then over Thanksgiving, my father says to me, we're Americans now. So, I mean, they hung on to this notion of being authentically Vietnamese for decades, which is totally understandable for refugees and for immigrants, right, of that generation. You want to hang on to your identity, which is your authenticity. Then you go back and you realize things have changed. You have changed. You, by the definitions of the people in your homeland, are no longer authentically Vietnamese, right? You're, in this case, Viet Kieu, overseas Vietnamese, whatever you want to call it. So authenticity is just really a dangerous thing, because people use it, as you're saying, to bludgeon other people to get them to behave in a certain kind of way, according to their own definition of whatever being authentic means. And we hang on to that desperately. So for example, I as a college student, I went to many Vietnamese culture nights as demonstrations of Vietnamese authenticity. And they're all the same for the most part. You know, you do your fan dance, you do your farm dance, you wear your ao dai, whatever. And that's Vietnamese culture as defined by college students, as told to them by their parents and the older generation. And it speaks to our anxiety about who we are in this country. You go back to Vietnam, they don't do that shit. They don't do it. No one is going around doing a fucking fan dance. And the only people in the fields doing, you know, scooping up snails or whatever are the actual farmers, right? Authentic Vietnamese culture is like a Vietnamese dude driving a Lamborghini in Saigon that you can't drive for more than 30 miles an hour. That is Vietnamese culture today. But instead we define Vietnamese culture in this really static, frozen thing. And we don't hold the United States, just to use this country as an example, to that standard. You know, like, Americans are not going around wearing tricorn hats, whipping slaves, wearing powdered wigs as a demonstration of their authenticity for the most part. So American culture gets to change, we get stuck being authentic. So for us to hold on to it is in some ways, I mean, it makes us feel good. We can say, that's authentic pho, you don't know what you're talking about. But on the other hand, it also is a way of trapping us in a certain kind of frozen mindset as well. All right, next question, Philip.
Okay, so sort of on the topic of what is authentic and this idea of Vietnamese-ness, right? Bao Nguyen asked, is there a Vietnamese story, either modern or historical, that you'd like to see adapted for the screen? Our friend Bao.
That's you, Viet.
Was it Vietnamese Americans? I was drinking and looking at the questions. So, is there a movie that I want to get made? What is that?
Is there a particular Vietnamese story, modern or historical, that you'd like to see adapted to the screen?
If I want to get shot, I would say Ho Chi Minh's biography. You know, okay, we won't talk about that. I think Saigon would be great. Why not Saigon? You know, there was a whole skateboarding film, Mind the Gap. It's a great film, right? And that was made by Chinese-American director, brilliant film. And he signed on now to do On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, right? So there's plenty of room for adapting many kinds of Vietnamese stories. And of course, we've already had Journey from the Fall and Green Dragon talking about refugee experiences in California. But, you know, I'd love to see the idiosyncratic stories of people like Phuc, you know, who are growing up in just very unique circumstances. And to demonstrate, as some of the people in the comments are saying, if you're Vietnamese, you're Vietnamese. It's not like you have some kind of generic definition of what being Vietnamese is. So the more stories, the better.
And to circle back to that, like I see that with my LGBTQ friends also. Like I think there's a lot of gatekeeping, right, in communities where you're a marginalized community already. And so I don't know who appoints those gatekeepers, but I think there's a self-preservation there that's more fierce, you know, that's like fiercely felt. I don't know, like, do you think that's true? Like that, you know, when you're in a small group, like you're circling your wagon, so to speak, and
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course we see gatekeepers where we shouldn't see gatekeepers among minority communities. You know, people have a mindset that they got to get theirs, and when they get theirs, they're going to control things. And DVAN, let me just make a pitch for DVAN, Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. We are not about that, you know. Like we are about community, collaboration, horizontal relationships, and creating opportunities like this to promote other, you know, lots of writers. And I'm glad to share whatever platform or influence that I might have to do that, you know, because I really believe that if we subscribe to the gatekeeper mentality, that what it leads to is one person wanting to hog the spotlight, you know. So one person can be the voice for the voiceless, one person can be the voice for the Vietnamese community. That's bullshit. We should have many voices. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad I'm having this conversation with you because we're very different. And that demonstrates just in a little bit the diversity of who we are as Vietnamese Americans, and that there's no singular definition. And that's what DVAN is here to promote.
On the topic of Phuc's book title, Saigon, question from Evan Lay Espiritu Gandhi. It's a play on Saigon, the former capital of the Republic of South Vietnam. She asked, particularly since being Vietnamese is not necessarily the defining part of your identity, what inspired you to title your memoir Saigon?
Ooh, yeah, wow, that's great. So I think I wanted a title that was evocative of loss, that, you know, and also I wanted to reclaim, you know, the writing of Saigon as two words and not one, you know. So like I think in, you know, sort of American media, like Vietnam and Saigon just got smushed, you know, they just kind of wrote it however they wanted it. So I wanted to reclaim it as two words, also to evoke, you know, sort of a feeling of loss and nostalgia. And also I think, you know, as quick of a metaphor as it could be, like I wanted the experience for readers and people talking about it to recognize that it looked one way and sounded another way. And that's pretty much like the, you know, as deep of a metaphor as I can come up with for my experience of growing up in this, you know, country as a refugee, you know, that, you know, people look at you, right, and they're like, oh, you don't look like a Latin teacher, you know, and I'm like, oh, really? Why? Or, you know, or I didn't expect you to be a tattooer, or, you know, whatever. I mean, I think it's about sort of defying expectations, or at least, you know, twisting them a little bit.
And to kind of follow up on that point that you just made, Pauline Cho asks, how did you get into art and tattooing as well? I know we have some of your tattoo that we can also show. And yeah, and then I'll get to the second part of the question.
Yeah, you know, hanging out with all those like naughty punk rock kids that my parents told me to not hang out with. You know, I was a piece of my story that I think got excised out of the book was sort of my love of art. You know, like the book has a particularly literary bend, but I mean, I think I was deeply into art as well, and so. You know, after grad school, I was offered a tattoo apprenticeship. I moved to New York City and I became a tattooer. Yeah. So I did not go to art school, but
can you talk to us about the tattoos that we're seeing on the screen?
Yeah, so both of these are so generally, you know, speaking, when I work with clients, like they'll come up into me and they'll talk to me about like an image that they want. And actually the tattoo on the left was actually really interesting because this client actually wrote a whole essay about what he wanted the tattoo to be, like kind of like a good and evil, Garden of Eden, you know, light and dark kind of imagery. And so I just drew this up in like an Art Nouveau style, and then tattooed it on him. And then on the right.
So you actually sketch it first before you do it, right? So they can see the whole thing. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
What body part are we looking at with the Adam and Eve?
Upper arm.
Upper arm, okay. And I just realized, I was like, what body part on the right are we talking about? I realized, oh my God, it's someone's hip.
Yeah. So on the right was a client, and she just wanted a blue tiger with some lotuses. So that's what I drew up for her.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do people come from all over to work with you, or are they just like locals?
I would say about, I'd say like half to 60% of my clientele are out of state. I mean, I have some far traveling clients. Like I actually, you know, I had some clients from, I have a client from Houston who's come up to get tattooed twice, I think, and clients in Portland, Oregon, and farther afield. But mostly it's like Northeast travel. Yeah, mostly.
How long do these tattoos take?
I think the one on the left took about 18 hours, I'd say. And then the one on the right, probably 12.
Wow.
And so I do them in 3-hour sessions. So it takes, you know, multiple sessions. So over like, let's say 6 months. So the client on the left would come in, get tattooed, and then leave, and then come back a month later. You know, it's like therapy, right? Just once a month, you know, 3 hours.
It's like a work in progress over a few months.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So then when you have your own tattoos, right?
Yes.
Now, let me say this. Phuc has agreed that he might show us some of his more intimate tattoos, as in basically what we can't see with his shirt on. Am I right? If we achieve a certain level of pledges for donations to DVAN. Okay. So,
is this legal? Wait, is this legal? I don't want you guys to get into trouble.
No. I mean, like, this is a waist up, okay? I'm not going to ask about tattoos below the waist. It's all right. But let me remind people, we're an arts organization, and for most of our existence, which has been well over a decade, we've done it purely out of the goodness of our hearts. That's really not a way to run an arts organization. So we're trying to become very professional, and we've been fairly successful. We've raised a lot of donations from bigger donors and grants and things like that. We have more work to do. We're hiring full-time staff members and part-time staff members, so we're paying real money. All of this takes money. All right, and so in our own small way here, that's why we've started to charge for some of our events. Some of you have actually paid for tickets. We're going to do more of that, and I hope, you know, hopefully you receive it in this spirit that art isn't free. I mean, art is a gift from the artist for sure, but the artist has got to live, and so do arts organizations. So if from now to the end of our session, which is we have about 25 more minutes, we achieve a certain number of pledges in the chat window, and we will do the honor system. We will assume that you will actually follow through. Then Phuc will reveal something below the collar, right? Okay. Is that acceptable?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. What is the dollar value for you to do that?
Oh gosh, I'm going to defer to you or Philip. You mean like a grand total?
Yeah, like a sum. And people are chipping in right now. So let's see. I mean, imagine that they're stuffing dollars in your G-string or something, you know, like the digital equivalent of that, right?
$500?
No, you are selling yourself cheap. We already have donations well over $100. Oh my God. This is your upper body we're talking about.
All right. I'm a cheap date, man. Come on.
You're being Vietnamese. No way. No way.
Okay, you're haggling me higher. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's see what the final dollar amount is, and then I'll decide what's worth the reveal.
This is such a fucking haggling technique. Like, show me what you got, and then we'll talk about it. All right, people. Don't be cheap. Don't be Vietnamese. Don't do the dollar tip.
Good hits for
That's the thing. Like, for like years, my dad, no matter what the tally was on the bill, would put a dollar tip on the table, and then I'd have to like put some more. Once I had a job, I'd have to put some more money on the table. Now my dad is like, okay, I'm going to give him actually a 20% tip at the local Vietnamese restaurant, which I think is an incredible accomplishment. So anyway, from now until let's say 7:50, that's 17 more minutes. Show some love for DVAN, show some love for Phuc Tran and his work as a tattoo artist, and we'll see what he's got under the collar. Philip, next question.
Yes, so the second part of the how did you get into making art and tattooing, ironically enough, is curious about your family's Catholic roots, and how it had an effect on you and your family growing up. How did you navigate that? As we're talking about you taking off your shirt to hundreds of viewers online.
Yeah, I mean, I am definitely a recovering Catholic. I don't know about you, Viet. I was, yeah, I mean, I was confirmed Catholic, and it didn't seem like a liberatory sort of vehicle for me. Like I think, wow, you're doubling down.
My part in this is over, by the way. So yeah.
I think for my parents, like everything in Catholicism was like a whole lot of like, don't do this, don't do that. And I was just, it didn't seem to affirm anything positive for me. So, but that's for me. I mean, there are plenty of amazing people who are Catholic, and I was just saying to somebody, in high school I subscribed to Marxist Catholic Worker, right? Like this like Marxist publication. So it was pretty amazing. So.
Yeah, I'm a screwed up Catholic too. I mean, my parents are devout Catholics. In their retirement, their idea of fun was go to church every single day. Yeah. And I grew up in this refugee community, so we actually had a Vietnamese mass. So I go to Vietnamese mass every week, and then I learned Vietnamese or some kind of Vietnamese through going to Vietnamese Catholic Sunday school, which was like the worst experience ever. And then I had Catholic school most of my life, and I went to Jesuit college preparatory with an all-boys school. So I've been very deeply schooled in Catholicism. And guess what? I'm an atheist. So, I mean, I don't know what happened, but you went punk rocker, I went atheist, But being a Catholic and being, tormented about it is really, really good for being an artist or a writer. It gives us a lot to talk about, a lot of symbology, as you saw here with Adam and Eve. Yeah. So it's all rich, and it's made us who we are. Next question, Philip. All right. No donation is too small. No donation is too big either, by the way. But no donation is too small.
I'm shocked, but people really want to see these tattoos, huh?
All this means is that our next guest has to be willing to do something for donations. I think we have a gimmick here.
Yeah, the bar is either very high or very low. Right?
We are, by my count, sitting at about 650 right now. As we get into the next question.
Good, pretty good.
Garen Del Carmen asks, and I think this is for both of you, how would you both approach Asian Americans who carry racism towards other minorities, especially towards Black people of color, if their racism stems from personal experiences of trauma, especially violent trauma? And I think that's so relevant to this current moment too.
Well, you want to tackle that first?
I mean, I'll say this, like, I think, I've been reading Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, which is incredible. And I think I want to acknowledge like personal trauma, like that's terrible that happened. I think assigning it to groups of people, that kind of behavior, that's where it's problematic for me. I think that the challenge for us is to, sort of approach each interaction as an individual interaction, right? It's an individual exchange, right? So that's all I have to say on that.
I'm going to type in some links. I've had a lot of these conversations on my Facebook author profile. I'll put that up too in case people care. But, you know, there are a lot of very sincere, passionate young Vietnamese Americans out there, and older ones too, obviously, who care about these kinds of issues, and they're deeply frustrated because of the level of racism in the Vietnamese community. We're really racist. And some of that you can argue is based on just ignorance or lack of awareness of the American context in this case, and that is true, that people don't know the history of civil rights and all that kind of thing. But a racist is a racist. You have a callus on your soul. You're not able to empathize with other people. If you were actually a fully fledged human being, you would be able to empathize with somebody regardless of who they are in whatever circumstance you find yourself in. And it's simply going back to the Catholic ideas, you know, treat other people as you want to be treated. And so many people are not capable of doing that. And it's particularly nasty to hear it when it's said in Vietnamese or spoken by in English by Vietnamese bros, you know, and Vietnamese sisters too. I mean, there's a lot of Vietnamese racist women too, as I've seen. So there are communities out there that are trying to work this through. I posted one, the Viet Solidarity and Action Network on Facebook. It's a really invigorating discussion. Also, Pivot, the Progressive Vietnamese Network, is the first, I think, professional organization trying to influence change politically, electorally through politics. So you can join them there as well. They're doing great work with trying to get Vietnamese-American politicians elected and doing things like bilingual education. So one of the things that are happening, you know, is that people are also trying to translate things into Vietnamese based on this idea that there are, you know, Vietnamese people out there, the older generation or newer immigrants who just need to be persuaded or educated. Let's translate Black Lives Matter and so on into Vietnamese for them. Pivot and the people in the Viet Solidarity and Action Network are really trying to do that. And so you can join, and you know, if you want those lessons and everything, they're posted there. And for me as a parent, you know, raising kids here in the States, and Phuc, you are too, so maybe you can speak to this. I'm deeply aware that we're in a racist country, you know, because these racist ideas circulate just like sexist ideas. You can try to protect your kids from gender roles. They're going to be inundated. You can try to protect your kids or not protect them, as the case may be, from racist ideas they're still going to learn. And my son, you know, I send him to liberal progressive schools. He's 6 years old. He's already encountered 2 incidents of anti-Black racism spoken by kids who don't know any better. And where are they hearing it? They're hearing it from their parents, white parents, Asian parents. So we have to do our best as parents, at the very least, to do that, to educate them. So, you know, on my end, I formed a Vietnamese parent group to teach Vietnamese to our kids, but instead of doing it through the Bible, you know, we're all progressives, you know, we do it through other kinds of lessons. Our last lesson was on Black Lives Matter. And we did, you know, that includes words like, you know, justice, equality, George Floyd, police, to get the kids to think about these things. And they already know about these things. You know, they're 6 years old, they can absorb these kinds of concepts. So education does start at home with our kids and with our families, our relatives, and it really sucks. And with our kids, we have a greater control. But Thanksgiving dinner, I've had this with people who are just saying racist stuff, and it's really, really difficult. So more power to all of you as you struggle to do that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that question. So an update from the donation box. We are currently at 1.3K.
Oh God!
But
right.
before we get there, we have some pictures of Phuc clothes.
By the way, before we get to that, Phuc, you don't have to show us, but do you have tattoos over every part of your body?
I'm like at 80% coverage, maybe 85% coverage.
Well, your head is about 10%.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No.
So
really? Skin? I mean, it's covered with hair too, right?
Okay. Well, your face. You know, so
Yeah.
all right.
These are not covered, but.
All right. Okay. So what are we looking at?
So we asked Phuc to actually send us a couple of images of himself to
Yeah.
add a little bit more nuanced context to who he is as an author, Latin teacher, tattooist, et cetera, et cetera. Phuc, would you mind explaining us what's going on in these couple of...
Sure, yeah. On the left there, yet I'm throwing down the gauntlet. I narrated my own audiobook, so I'm just letting you know. If I can do it, you can do it too, buddy.
Let me interrupt you here. Does your book, I don't remember very clearly, does it have accents or other languages?
It does.
And do you do them?
Yes.
Like, for example, what kind of accents do you hear in the book?
So I say Vietnamese words, right? Like,
Okay, I can do that. I can do that.
and then there's French. So I have to say like Jean-Paul Sartre. And then I say French words like mise en scène and pièce de résistance.
I forgot you're the language specialist. How embarrassing. But I did my audiobook of the refugees, and in the middle of it, I realized, oh my God, there's like Australian English in here. There's British English in here. I can't do this stuff. I had to call my editor who's British and say, here, record this line for me. So I can try to imitate this, but yeah, it's really acting. So more power to you.
Oh God, so hard. It was so hard. Yeah, they're professionals who do it, and that's why they're professionals. The middle picture is just me. I think I was just like a timed selfie taking a ride on my motorcycle.
Disgusting. It's disgusting how cool you are. Skateboards, motorcycles. Come on, man.
Well, I mean, motorcycles is just grown-up skateboards because you don't want to as much, right? And then on the right is me eating a scorpion in Beijing, China. I was on a school trip there.
I might have been in the same market. I didn't eat the scorpion, but I ate like a starfish, from what I remember.
Yeah. I'll eat anything once.
People are talking about in the chat about Vietnamese lessons. On the Viet Solidarity and Action Network, there's a guy there who's posting daily language lessons about important words. So you can join in there.
And I didn't actually know about Pivot until Philip was just telling me pre show. So that's really exciting to know about Pivot.
Yeah.
Is that a national? I mean, you guys.
Yeah. They've raised money and advocated for Vietnamese-American, candidates in Georgia, in Massachusetts, for example. And so, people are making inroads at these, state level elections, which is really awesome.
Yeah, and there's also a call to action, Pivot 2020, to
right.
This Sunday to get folks to call the arms.
Yeah, I'm speaking there at the beginning for like, I don't know, hopefully 30 seconds, but yeah, get involved, people.
One on conservatism, progressivism, Phuc Tran has a question actually on the transference of conservatism from Viet refugees to their children. Many had to change to working class careers, which they didn't hold in their homeland, then instilling a sense of classism to their children. They want to know if y'all have any thoughts, especially the conservatism and some Southern Viet people who still hang on to a separate Vietnam, and they're thinking about Orange County.
That's you.
Okay. I think Orange County is a very particular place. I mean, that's Little Saigon. That's the capital of the Vietnamese American diaspora. I wouldn't say it's the capital of the world diaspora, because if you go to different countries, Vietnamese people are not the same. I went to Canada. I said American imperialism in Canada, and the Vietnamese were like, yeah, Americans are imperialists. You say American imperialism here, as I have done in the New York Times, for example, or on my Facebook page. People said, do you know where American imperialism comes from? That's a communist idea. And in Australia, maybe it's as conservative as it is here in the States, but in France, they're communists. There's Vietnamese communists in France. And that's a totally different political situation. So I think Little Saigon and Orange County, very particular, deeply conservative in this sense that Talene is talking about. And of course, in places like that and San Jose, maybe in Texas, with high concentrations of Vietnamese, the ability of, and this is great, the ability of Vietnamese people to create their own culture with their own newspapers, their own TV, their own entertainment, means that they can recreate every aspect of the culture, including their political convictions. And of course, the political convictions of this portion of the diaspora is South Vietnamese nationalism and nostalgia. And that's a legitimate form of politics. I don't agree with it, but it's a legitimate form of politics. And so people transmit their politics to their children. I mean, I try to transmit my politics to my child. If my child grew up to be a flag-waving MAGA person, I'd be deeply disappointed. So there's no surprise that South Vietnamese refugees want to recreate their politics in their children. I think the difference here, though, of course, is that there's a larger context of the United States, and a lot of younger Vietnamese Americans are trending Democratic, unlike their parents, So there is some counteraction to that. But again, Little Saigon, Orange County, very particular, simply because of Bolsa Avenue and the huge concentration of Vietnamese people there and the amount of political peer pressure that they're able to exert. But even in Orange County, we have seen Black Lives Matter protests done by Vietnamese Americans in the heart of Little Saigon. So, and there are progressive organizations there like Vietnamese-American Arts and Letters Association. So these communities exist, and younger Vietnamese Americans who are progressive have the opportunity to join those organizations and to try to amplify those voices. And we have to begin somewhere. Look at Florida and Arizona. All of a sudden, these states seem to be, possibly leaning blue. So even Little Saigon, perhaps, maybe in 20 years, might be oriented in that direction too.
Thank you for that. Eminor Rigby, I have another question. Asks, as parents for both of you, how do you approach exposing / protecting your children from experiencing the generational trauma that your parents may have passed on to you?
I mean, as soon as I found out that I was going to have kids, I went straight into counseling, like went straight into therapy, and really like that. I don't say that as like a punchline. Like I just thought, how am I going to parent my kids or my child at the time? And I thought, do I do the opposite of my father? Like that doesn't seem like a plan for parenting. That just seems reactionary, right? And so, yeah, I think, shout out to mental health. So if only to free up space for me to be thoughtful and engaged in being a parent, and, also, not Catholic, just for us, no judgment, but yeah.
I just want to say that one of the questions is, for me, my girlfriend wonders if you can be her dad, which I think is both a compliment and really freaking depressing, because I'm like, oh my God.
Is that for you?
Yeah. But for the parenting question, yeah, that was a huge issue for me, because I never wanted to be a father, never wanted to be a father. But if I wanted to keep my wife, I had to be a father. So, that was a sort of preordained. And now, I was very lucky to, in some ways, to have parents who worked their asses off to provide for their kids. So I never had to worry about material things. I mean, I grew up thinking we were poor because I could never get Legos or whatever, but everything else was taken care of, But at the same time, my parents were working so much that they had no time to spend with me. So there was an emotional absence there, which I think is very common to immigrants and refugee people. So with my own son, obviously, I do want to try to be different, but not in the sense of like giving him whatever he wants and spoiling him materially, but giving him enough so that he has a nice childhood, but also trying to raise him with a sense of ethical political values. My parents raised me with a Catholic sense of ethical values, which in some ways is kind of screwed up, but has left me with a deep sense of moral outrage and social justice, which is the Catholic legacy that I want to take away from Catholicism, especially through my Jesuit education. So I think with our children, we have the opportunity, hopefully, to imagine the childhood that we want and try to do it again with them. And it's not just about politics and morality; it's also about emotions. I think a lot of us got screwed up, of our generation, you and me, by being the children of refugees who underwent such terrible trauma, and then that affected us too. So even though I joke with my son a lot about being a refugee, like whenever he gets something that I didn't get, I ask him, do you know why I didn't have any Legos when I was a kid? And he'll say, because you're a refugee. And yes, that's true. But I want him to grow up with a sense of emotional nourishment as well that I didn't get, not due to any fault of my parents, but simply because of our historical circumstances. And that's basically, I think, the best we can do as parents is to spend time with our kids and, try to make them into emotionally fulfilled people.
And also on the topic of these kind of shared historical circumstances, Chi Bui and a couple of folks in the asked about growing up with different perspectives of the Vietnam War, and how might people go about starting this conversation, considering differences in perspective. And for Chi, they're a Vietnamese international student from Hanoi, now working in the U.S.
Well, that's also you, Viet. I'm going to pass this off to Viet, who's talked a lot and seen all the movies, including The Five Bloods.
Well, let me just say that I can speak to this very personally, around the issue of, for one example, the flag. The flag is a very personal issue for Vietnamese Americans. They hate, on average, the red flag with the yellow star of the current Vietnamese government. They see that as a communist flag. So, for example, in California, there's a law that was passed to say that the Vietnamese heritage flag that will be flown in all public places of California will be the South Vietnamese flag, the yellow flag with 3 red stripes. It's a hugely divisive issue in the Vietnamese-American community that they wanted to make sure that they only ever saw the yellow flag. My campus, University of Southern California, has an international area where all the flags around of all the countries around the world are hung. I never really looked twice to see what the Vietnamese flag was, but apparently the Vietnamese flag was the red flag with the yellow star. So one day, this infamous Vietnamese-American activist came to campus and stapled the yellow flag on top of the red flag. So I had to do an event, brought together the Vietnamese Student Association, which is all Vietnamese Americans, and the Vietnamese International Student Association, which is all foreign students from Vietnam, to talk about this issue that Jaed Coffin is raising and what the flag symbolizes, and of course all the related issues of war and history and so on. It was a very interesting conversation because the Vietnamese international students basically said, we know this history, we want to reconcile with you, we want to put the past behind us as Vietnamese people. The Vietnamese American students said, we can't do that. This history, affected our parents and our grandparents. They lost their country. We can't let that go. So you have these 2 divides. And on the one hand, you could say that the Vietnamese American students were suffering from, what we would call melancholy. Can't let go of the past. But you can also look at the Vietnamese international students and say, it's great that they wanted to reconcile, but they had the privilege of being on the winning side. And they had the privilege of being the majority in Vietnam. Those of them who were Gin Vietnamese, and that raises another issue we can talk about. For Vietnamese Americans, we're the minority and we lost the war, or our parents did, So this is a huge divide. And I think that for a younger generation, both in Vietnam and the United States, it is possible to have this conversation. At least we had this conversation in a room without protest and macing and all that kind of stuff that happens outside in Little Saigon. We had a civil conversation to illustrate that these differences existed. And there are progressives now in the Vietnamese American community who are not opposed, for example, to thinking that Ho Chi Minh is not the devil and that we should think of him as a complex historical figure. And there are Vietnamese people in Vietnam and who are coming here as foreign students who are not thinking that the Southern Vietnamese are puppets and traitors and everything like that. So I have some hope that these kind of conversations can continue to take place. But it takes place against the background of these older generations, both in Vietnam and in the United States, who have real, political hangups from their particular experiences, which are totally valid. But that's not our generational experience, or the generation, as someone kindly pointed out, below me, the 20-year-olds and so on, who have the opportunity not to be hung up by the past, and that's actually a good thing.
Last question before we haven't forgotten, Phuc, that we've pledged to see some of your tattoos. The participants and everyone watching live would like to know Vietnamese American writers or producers or artists, movie producers that you all would know.
Yeah, there's so many. The dangerous thing about saying anybody's names is that I'm going to forget some people. So, anyway, let's have a quick back and forth. You say a name, I'll say a name.
Yeah, Bao Nguyen just did the amazing Bruce Lee documentary on ESPN. Like that really I thought was just spectacular. So
yeah, and then because of the 5 Bloods, of which I also wrote an op-ed, by the way, people have been asking what kind of Vietnamese films should we watch, and I say Bao Ham Jun's Journey from the Fall, which is our South Vietnamese American epic about the fall of Saigon, and which is available on Netflix. And then, Dang Nhật Minh's When the 10th Month Comes, which is really a beautiful, deeply moving film about what the war and its aftermath were like for the communist Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Back to you. Yeah.
Vuong's book is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read. Really gorgeous.
On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, of course. Thi Bui, The Best We Could Do, comic book memoir that's very powerful. And if you buy the paperback edition, for the paperback edition, there's a special insert there that features her interviewing me, talking about my hair. and other more important issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think like Andrew X-Fam's book was probably one of the first books that I read, Catfish and Mandala. Like, I think for me, like he was like OG, like, sort of like expat, or Vietnamese-American, writing about the Vietnamese-American experience. It's a travel log. That's great.
Yeah, so people are saying Chicken of the Sea, that is the children's book that I did with my son, Ellison, About Nin's The Sorrow of War. It is a great classic of the Vietnam War, but just really a classic of war literature in general, really amazing. Amy Quan Berry's She Weeps Each Time You're Born, I think is the great undersung Vietnamese-American novel. And I can't help but think it's partly because Amy Quan Berry is mixed race Vietnamese, and she's African-American and Vietnamese. It's an incredible novel about the Vietnam War and its aftermath. I really recommend it. And yeah, what's that?
Mountain Sing.
Yeah, The Mountain Sing by Viet Thanh Nguyen. I blurbed that. I Love Yous Are for White People by Lac Su, which has some similarities to your book because it does also deal with traumatizing, father-son relationships. I'm just gonna keep plugging books as people put them up, But Viet Gone by Nguyen Nguyen, he's a playwright. If you have a chance to see Viet Gone or its sequel, Poor Yellow Rednecks, he had the misfortune or good fortune, I don't know, of being settled through Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and these are totally redneck Vietnamese-American hip hop musicals. They're very obscene, they're very funny. If you have a chance to catch them, definitely do it, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a pretty good list for everyone. I mean, and it goes on and on, right? For everyone participating and viewing this live right now, this conversation will also be available if you register on Eventbrite and purchase the ticket. A link to this conversation will be sent to you so you can watch it on demand. We're kind of coming close to our end time, but I want to, I'm just going to plug some of our sponsors. The people who put this together and kind of highlight. Asia Book Center is the bookstore that we're partnering with, Eastwind Books of Berkeley. They're offering Phuc's Memoir Saigon for a discounted price. It's 10% off. So go ahead and visit asiabookcenter.com to get your own copy of Saigon. We also want to kind of close out and we know that you all have been donating throughout the conversation, but to continue to spread the word, like we kind of mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this is the first episode of our Accented program, a virtual series that we'll be having fairly regularly as we all are in shelter in place during this global pandemic. And to make conversations like this happen, to feature wonderful artists, authors like Phuc, and to continue to provide the resources for people to connect with Diasporic Vietnamese, Southeast Asian, Asian American artists from all over the world. We encourage you to donate bit.ly/donate to DVAN. And as we close out, I'm gonna go ahead and play this video for you all.
And by the way, don't leave yet. You still got to see Phuc stats. We still got to see Phuc stats.
Yeah, that's what's keeping everyone from leaving.
Yeah. All right, got it.
Videos.
I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen. I'm one of the co-founders of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. We started DVAN 10 years ago to provide a platform for Vietnamese-American and Vietnamese diasporic artists, writers, and filmmakers.
I'm Isabelle Tuipolo, the co-director of DVAN. We came a long way. We started 10 years ago because we didn't see a story in mainstream society, in history book, in classes. It was nowhere to be seen and to be heard.
Hi, my name is Dao Strom, and I'm a new co-director with DVAN. The Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network's primary mission is to promote stories of the Vietnamese diaspora.
And because our history is marked by displacements, because a lot of our family was spread in different countries before and after the war, we wanted to bring those stories together. Our story matters, and we have power to change the world.
With your support, DVAN will be able to continue developing its projects. One of these is She Who Has No Masters, the work of the Women's Arts Collective. A second is continuing publications through our online journal, Diacritics. And a third area, creating literary events and writing retreats that bring together emerging and established writers.
We're thrilled to have received an anonymous donation to support our cause. We'd be more thrilled if you helped us match that donation.
With your contribution, with your support, DVAN will be able to continue doing this important work.
Great. So please donate to DVAN if you haven't already. And here's the link one more time.
And buy Phuc's book.
And buy Phuc's book. Also, just to plug some of where you can find more information about DVAN, our blog, diacritics.org, you can access online. Also, you can follow us on Instagram and our Facebook page for the latest announcements. And if you wanted to reach out to us and suggest any future potential guests for our Accented series. And with that, that is all from me on behalf of DVAN. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and joining us in this conversation with Viet and Phuc. And
what's our total? What's our total?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, what is the total?
Our total, according to my count, is just a little under $1,500.
Amazing. And you were gonna do it for $100, man.
Yeah, that was really good, right? For 90 minutes worth of work.
The lesson is don't undersell yourself and your art.
That was triple what I was
Oh
doing.
my God, we're going to see this? Okay, okay.
This is good, all right? This is on theme, by the way. It's on trend.
Yeah.
So this is the tattoo of my grandfather.
Oh my God.
So he passed away a couple years ago, so I got a portrait of him.
That's
so,
amazing.
You know, really nice, right?
Yeah. That is so much better than just your usual black and white photo that people have on their mantelpieces.
Yeah, that was good. Yep. And then I almost got my belly button tattooed. That did not feel great.
Oh my God. What's the point of getting your belly button tattooed? People can't even see it.
Yeah, I just didn't even want to do it because it just hurt so much. But yeah, so there you go. There's a picture of my grandfather.
How's That's that? Amazing.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for sharing. Oh my gosh. What's the? Well, let's go back to the is it a dragon or that you have there?
So that's my dragon on my stomach. Yep.
So who do you go to for your tattoos?
Different friends, like people whose work I admire. The guy who did my stomach works in New York City. His name is Mike Rubendahl. He works at Kings Avenue in New York. And then Chris Dingwell did the portrait of my grandfather right after he passed away. Yeah,
that's amazing. I mean, it's like, who do priests go to do their confessions? Who do tattoo artists go to do their tattoos? Hey man, this was a freaking amazing conversation. I couldn't imagine a better way of ending it than seeing your tummy and all the fabulous tattoos there.
I hope this is the start of everyone's weekend, right?
Yeah, man. Awesome. Everybody who's out there, thank you so much for joining us with Philip and Phuc and with our first official episode for Accented. We have your information. We'll send you an email, I believe, with whatever our next event is. We're planning to do this once a month at the very least, bringing you the best of the diasporas of Southeast Asia across the arts. And of course, we'll be speaking about politics and culture, just hosting really interesting people like Phuc. And so we'll see you again. It's been a real pleasure. I'll try to come up with a different drink for next time. I am just at my limit right now. I can barely put together a straightforward sentence, but Phuc, it was a real pleasure to meet you. This is our second time virtually. I hope one day we will have the chance to meet in person, not for a tattoo personally, but just to, talk.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah. Good night. Have a great weekend.